Trump White House realized that that's not the terrain they want to fight this issue on. They want to fight the issue on exactly what you said before. Should those nonprofits that are helping illegal aliens come to the country, should they get funding?
Welcome to the Debrief with the Washington Examiner. I'm Tiana Lowe Doescher here with our commentary editor, Conn Carroll. Conn, Donald Trump really has kicked off his presidency with much more action and concerted action than we saw last time. And one of the bigger early controversies is him trying to rein in spending, specifically in pet projects, progressive pet projects that Republicans and increasingly independents are opposed to, right? So there are a couple of notable ones. One, the Protecting the American People Against Invasion, which is to defund these nonprofits that I've seen up close in Springfield, Ohio, down at the border, that resettles illegal immigrants or immigrants that came in illegally and then were granted temporary protected status. There's defunding DEI in the federal government, gender ideology extremism. But then we've seen a walk back. Can you explain it from your legal background? What power does Trump actually have here, and why did he walk back this order somewhat?
Sure. So to be clear, the executive orders that he issued in the first week, the three by name you just mentioned, he didn't walk any of those back. What did happen was that on Monday, you had the OMB, which is under the White House, but still, separate from Trump, issued a separate memo that says, look, all of these executive orders that Trump issued last week, we need you, the federal agencies, to start identifying the programs that are affected by these. And oh, by the way, you need to freeze the program, immediately start all these programs starting this next Tuesday through February 20th. And so that was the memo that worried a lot of people. And that was the memo that a day later, the White House OMB actually ended up rescinding. But the orders specifically by name that you mentioned, those still stand. Those still stand. And Carolyn Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was very clear saying, look, we are still going to pursue cutting off funding for these nonprofits through these executive orders.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the debate about the larger EO that gets walked back, it's about whether or not you pause and then review the funding, or review the funding and then pause the offenders, right?
Sure. So you had a number of nonprofits that would be affected by this funding. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that actually went to court to sue. And when you look at the complaint, it was very telling because the complaint itself didn't call upon a violation of the Impoundment Control Act in his complaint. They did not say that that's what Trump did wrong. Instead, they say Trump arbitrarily and capriciously stopped this funding under the Administrative Procedures Act. So they're making an APA claim, a completely separate legal claim. And I think evidenced by the fact that the OMB did rescind the memo, I think there probably was some overbroad language in the memo itself that may have triggered an APA claim. That's where they clawed it back. But the more specific executive orders that target individual programs, those are still in effect. And I would still expect to see litigation on each of those. But, when you saw the outrage over the memo, you saw Medicaid portals being shut down. You saw people complaining.
Was that just malicious compliance? Or?
I do think that was malicious compliance, absolutely. And then you also saw people say, oh, no, Meals on Wheels programs are going to end. And I think the Trump White House realized that that's not the terrain they want to fight this issue on. They want to fight the issue on exactly what you said before. Should those nonprofits that are helping illegal aliens come to the country, should they get funding?
So I have a broader question about the Impoundment Control Act. So as viewers might recall, back in 2019, this was what was at the crux of the whole impeachment #1 Ukraine proceeding, where in the end, Donald Trump, Government Accountability Office, found that Trump did not violate the law because it was Congress authorized aid to Ukraine. Trump's OMB sat on it, but not past the deadline, right? Because Congress issues a deadline for when this spending must go out. And although they held it for a little bit, they didn't wait until after that deadline.
Sure.
So it was legal, right?
Yeah.
Even it could be politically questionable, but it was legal. In these cases, obviously Congress does have the power of the purse, but they've delegated away so much of their power. So for instance, let's just take very narrowly these nonprofits that did this migrant resettlement. So those, we do know, is funded by FEMA and DHS. We know that FEMA spends hundreds of millions of dollars on it.
Yes.
If Congress says we're giving FEMA this money, is it because Congress has delegated away that power that even though the Impoundment Control Act still exists, Trump has more jurisdiction to decide, well, I'll give it to FEMA, but I don't want to give it to the nonprofits to resettle migrants.
Yes.
Is that how that power works?
Essentially, I would say the short answer is yes. That is what, Trump's going to be arguing each of these cases on the most narrow grounds possible. And what he's going to be saying is, look, yes, this money has been targeted for FEMA for, specific purposes, but I don't agree with the way these grants have been allocated. He'll definitely be making those arguments there. But they're also itching to fight the Impoundment Control Act generally, which has never survived a true test in the Supreme Court. There are two cases that people often point to say, oh, the president doesn't have the power of impoundment, but neither of those actually dealt with the Impoundment Control Act. So in 1974, you had Richard Nixon, 2 years after the Impoundment Control Act was passed. He held back some sewer rebuilding money from the city of New York, and the city of New York sued. And that case did go all the way to the Supreme Court. But that case was decided on the very narrow language of that Treatment Water Control Act, not the Impoundment Control Act. Separately, 9 years later, or two decades later, Clinton went to court and lost also against the city of New York, Clinton versus the city of New York. But that was on the line item veto, a completely different act.
Okay.
So the Impoundment Control Act has never actually been tested by the Supreme Court. And this court that is very concerned with separation of powers, you look at Loper-Bright, you look at SEC versus Javansky, this is a court that does not want the powers mixed. And the Impoundment Control Act definitely did that. And if it did go to the court, I'm pretty sure it would lose.
In layman's terms, so just put an example here for us, for those of us that are new to the legalese of it. What would it look like in terms of Trump proposing something? What would be the legal challenge? And then what would be the question that the Supreme Court would have to determine?
Sure. So you'd have some nonprofit whose grant was canceled. They would obviously claim harm from there. Obviously, they're not getting money, so that's an obvious harm. That would go to court. And they would say, look, Congress authorized this payment. Trump has rescinded it. He doesn't have that power under the Impoundment Control Act. And so we are suing to force him to follow the law. That's how it would get before the court.
Okay. And this could all be avoided theoretically if Congress if they wanted to pass a bill saying, we want to give money to the Catholic Charities of Laredo for migrant resettlement, couldn't they just pass that? And then if that were passed and let's say the prior president had signed it into law and it were still in effect, then Donald Trump couldn't ignore it, right? If Joe Biden had approved a single item bill to fund.
Something that specifically to say, we are allocating this exact amount to this exact group for this exact purpose, that probably would not be able to be impounded. That would be under by the way of Train versus New York, the 1974 decision we talked about. But that's not what we're looking at here in any of these executive order cases that we're looking at.
And isn't that largely because it's a lot of Congress delegating that power away, or is it that?
Yeah. There's only so much Congress can say. Like from one of the very first bills passed by Congress was telling the executive branch to establish a post system, right? And so from the beginning, Congress didn't say you must build the post office at this cross street in this town and everything else. At some point, you do have to delegate a little bit to say you go ahead and figure out the postal system. Here's what the postal system looks like. So delegation is always going to be part of it, and it's just a question of where the executive or how specific Congress is going to be when they say how you're going to spend this money.
It's fascinating legal territory, and Conn, thank you so much. To read more of this analysis, explainer, everything we need to follow these crazy news cycles, head to washingtonexaminer.com. In the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for next week for this show. This is The Debrief with the Washington Examiner.